Hello, my friends. The modern geopolitical landscape is being reshaped by a series of choices made in Washington, Brussels, and other Western capitals, choices that have pushed the world closer to large-scale confrontation rather than stability. Throughout the discussions captured in the transcript, a clear thesis emerges. The United States and NATO are not acting as defensive alliances protecting peace, but rather as engines of permanent escalation, particularly with Russia. The war in Ukraine, framed publicly as a struggle for democracy, appears instead as a proxy conflict in which Western political, military, and economic interests override genuine national security concerns. At the center of this dynamic lies a paradox. Western leaders insist that Russia poses an existential threat to Europe, claiming that if Moscow prevails in Ukraine, Poland, the Baltics, Germany, and even the United Kingdom could be next. Yet the individuals interviewed in the transcript argued that this narrative is not based on objective military analysis, but rather on political necessity. European leaders, having invested years in telling their populations that defeating Russia in Ukraine is a matter of survival, cannot now reverse course without admitting failure. As economic crises grow across Europe, rising energy costs, deindustrialization, immigration pressures, and eroding living standards, maintaining the war narrative becomes a tool for avoiding accountability. From the American side, the situation is even more troubling. Recent U.S. defense legislation not only expands military budgets, but explicitly prohibits future administrations from withdrawing troops from Europe or South Korea. This represents a new and unsettling precedent. Congress, which constitutionally holds the power to declare war, is not merely authorizing force, but actively preventing demobilization. The result is a system in which endless entanglement in foreign conflicts is locked in by law. This is far removed from the vision articulated by America's founders, who warned against entangling alliances and foreign ambitions. The Ukraine war is a case study in this evolving military doctrine. According to reports referenced in the transcript, American generals were deeply involved in advising, planning, and directing Ukrainian operations, including the ill-fated 2023 counteroffensive. If this assessment is accurate, the battlefield outcome becomes not only a Ukrainian failure, but a Western failure, an exposure of the limitations of U.S. military planning when faced with Russian operational capability. The guest argues that this reality undermines decades of Western confidence in its own doctrine. Russia, operating under severe sanctions and international pressure, has nevertheless outmaneuvered a NATO-trained army supported by the most powerful economies in the world. Meanwhile, NATO officials publicly declare that Europe must prepare for a war on a scale not seen since World War II. Such statements suggest inevitability rather than diplomacy. They also obscure the role that Western policies played in provoking the conflict in the first place, namely the eastward expansion of NATO, support for political upheavals in Ukraine, and the cultivation of a geopolitical rivalry that left little room for compromise. The transcript highlights a point often ignored in mainstream Western media. Before judging Russia's actions, one must understand its stated strategic concerns, something Western journalists rarely attempt because interviews with Russian leadership are largely absent. Layered onto this geopolitical tension is a new and alarming frontier: the militarization of artificial intelligence. The Pentagon's launch of its own secure AI platform is described not as an innovation for efficiency, but as a tool designed to bypass the ethical restrictions embedded in consumer AI models. Civilian AI systems often refuse prompts involving targeted killings or fabricated justifications for war. Military AI, however, will not be burdened by such constraints. Historical precedents show that military precision technologies are rarely created to minimize civilian casualties. Rather, they are designed for efficiency and increased striking capacity. The transcript references chilling examples from Gaza, where AI systems such as Lavender and Where's Daddy allegedly assist in identifying targets and timing strikes at moments when entire families are present. The implication is that as AI becomes embedded in warfare, human moral judgment risks being replaced by automated systems optimized for lethality. All of this occurs against the backdrop of military decline masked by political bravado. Recent engagements reveal a U military struggling to maintain superiority, difficulties combating low-tech forces like the Houthis in the Red Sea, costly miscalculations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now strategic setbacks in Ukraine. Despite this, Washington simultaneously positions itself for direct confrontation with China by increasing naval operations in the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. The transcript argues that this reflects not strategic necessity, but the inability of an empire to imagine tools of influence beyond coercion. Economically, the picture is equally stark. While Americans are told that investments in healthcare, education, or infrastructure are too expensive, Congress easily approves massive increases in defense budgets. When veterans' health care costs, interest on past war debts, State Department military aid, and classified operations are included, the real annual cost of America's war machine reaches an estimated $7 trillion. The transcript contrasts the refusal to spend $30 billion to replace toxic lead water pipes in American cities with the tens of billions sent overseas for military operations or foreign conflicts. At the same time, the information environment becomes increasingly controlled. The suppression of dissenting views, whether regarding the Hunter Biden laptop story, whistleblowers, or critical analysis of you. This foreign policy is framed as protection from disinformation. Yet the transcript argues that this is less about truth and more about preserving narratives that justify perpetual conflict. The label conspiracy theorist, the guest notes, has historically served to silence those who question official accounts, from the JFK assassination to modern foreign interventions. Taken together, these elements form a cohesive picture, a Western political order in which militarism replaces diplomacy, censorship replaces open debate, AI replaces human judgment, and economic self-destruction replaces domestic investment. The Ukraine conflict is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of a deeper structural commitment to war as a means of maintaining global influence. The tragedy, the guests suggest, is that ordinary Americans and Europeans who do not want these wars are dragged into them by leaders who face no accountability for the consequences. In this analysis, the question is not merely whether Russia or NATO is right or wrong, but whether Western societies are willing to confront the machinery of escalation that now operates with alarming autonomy. As geopolitical tensions intensify, the world stands at a crossroads between acknowledging these systemic failures or plunging further into conflicts justified by narratives rather than reality. What becomes increasingly evident, when all the layers of the transcript are placed under a single analytical lens, is that the crisis unfolding in Ukraine is not merely the product of clashing national interests, but the culmination of a structural transformation in how Western power conceives of legitimacy, security, and control. The system that once advertised itself as a guardian of liberal order now increasingly reveals a very different face, one in which geopolitical dominance is pursued with tools that bypass public consent, while accountability erodes behind a facade of moral rhetoric. The West enters conflicts not because its people demand them, but because its institutional machinery has evolved to need them. This is why the transcript's recurring theme, the widening disconnect between Western governments and their own populations, cannot be dismissed. As a side note, in the United States, the political class speaks of defending freedom abroad while millions of citizens struggle to afford housing, health care, or basic necessities. Yet the same Congress that claims fiscal prudence instantly approves enormous military budgets, supplemental packages for foreign wars, and multi-year commitments to overseas deployments. In Europe, leaders warn of existential threats from Moscow, while their citizens confront spiraling energy bills, falling wages, and aging infrastructure. The gap between lived reality and political messaging grows to the point where fear of Russia becomes, for many governments, a convenient diversion from deeper structural decay. In this context, Ukraine becomes a symbolic battlefield, not merely a geographic front, but an ideological one. By framing the conflict as a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, Western leaders create an emotional binary that leaves no room for nuance. The transcript argues that this narrative construction conveniently obscures Western involvement in the internal political trajectory of Ukraine, including support for movements and governments aligned with NATO's long-term vision. To question this involvement is treated as disloyalty. To acknowledge Russia's security concerns is painted as sympathy for aggression. Such narrowing of debate is a hallmark of systems entering defensive ideological posture, systems that no longer rely on persuasion, but on control of discourse. Extending this insight reveals a deeper paradox. The more the West insists on controlling information, the more it signals its own insecurity. Media outlets that once prided themselves on adversarial journalism increasingly act as amplifiers for official positions, rarely challenging the claims of military or intelligence agencies regarding Russia, Ukraine, or NATO expansion. Interviews with Ukrainian leadership are treated not as opportunities for scrutiny, but as stages for moral theater. Meanwhile, Western media almost entirely excludes direct conversations with Russian leadership, creating an asymmetric information environment in which the public sees only one side's motives, grievances, and strategic logic. A society deprived of full information is more easily led into conflict, and as the transcript suggests, that may be precisely the point. The transcript's emphasis on AI-driven warfare is especially important in this regard because it signals the emergence of a new paradigm in which human judgment becomes secondary to algorithmic execution. When war can be automated, when target selection, timing, and even battlefield decisions migrate into machine logic, the threshold for escalation lowers dramatically. AI does not hesitate, does not fear consequences, does not weigh moral nuance. It optimizes, and optimization in warfare inherently maximizes lethality. This transition represents not merely technological progress, but a fundamental shift in the ethics of power. A government relying on AI systems to wage war can more easily claim plausible deniability, distancing itself from the human consequences of its decisions. At the same time, AI enables a scale of surveillance and information management that allows governments to shape public perception with unprecedented precision. In such an environment, the line between safeguarding democracy and manufacturing consent becomes dangerously thin. On the geopolitical front, the expanded analysis reveals that the West has not adjusted to the realities of multipolarity. While Washington and Brussels continue to operate under assumptions of unipolar authority, the rest of the world is reorganizing into alternative structures of cooperation. Russia and China's partnership, strengthened by sanctions and isolation policies, illustrates how attempts to weaken adversaries can paradoxically accelerate their alignment. The BRICS nations, representing a substantial portion of global population and economic output, are developing financial systems intended to circumvent Western dominance. Even countries traditionally aligned with the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, India, are diversifying their strategic relationships. This erosion of influence is not sudden. It is the inevitable result of overextension abroad and neglect at home. Ukraine, therefore, becomes a litmus test. A failure to impose a military defeat on Russia raises profound questions about the limits of Western power. If NATO, with its vast budgets, intelligence, infrastructure, and technological superiority, cannot engineer a decisive victory through its proxy, then its strategic model must be reevaluated. That reevaluation, however, would require political humility, something in short supply. Instead, leaders respond with escalatory rhetoric, insisting that greater militarization is the only path forward. Such logic is self-reinforcing. Failure leads to expansion. Expansion leads to deeper entanglement. And deeper entanglement leads to a point where disengagement becomes politically impossible. The result is a cycle in which conflict becomes perpetual, not because it is strategically necessary, but because withdrawing from it would expose the fragility of the system. Another dimension of the transcript worth expanding is the moral exhaustion of Western societies. People across the U.S. and Europe increasingly sense that their governments speak of principles while acting on interests, preach democracy abroad while undermining it at home, and demand sacrifice from citizens while insulating elites from consequences. This moral dissonance weakens the legitimacy of institutions and fuels populist reactions on both the left and the right. The Ukraine war becomes a symbol of misplaced priorities. Billions flow overseas while domestic crises deepen. AI censorship grows while economic mobility declines. Citizens are told to fear foreign threats while their own governments assert unprecedented control over speech, privacy, and dissent. In such an environment, the question posed almost silently in the transcript becomes unavoidable. What happens when the people of a democracy no longer believe in the moral authority of their leaders? When they see war not as a defense of values, but as a mechanism of empire? When they recognize that narratives of freedom are often deployed to justify policies that erode freedom domestically? The extended analysis suggests that the Ukraine conflict is not just a geopolitical crisis, but a mirror reflecting the internal contradictions of Western power. The attempt to preserve global dominance through military pressure, economic coercion, and narrative control reveals a system increasingly at odds with its own founding ideals. Whether the West can confront these contradictions or whether it will continue down a path of escalating confrontation may determine not only the future of Ukraine, but the future of the international order itself.